have made the mistake that I made when reading this program. I just skim-read it, and I read, enjoyment is the seasoning of things. It is the food of love. And so I thought today's lecture was called The Recipes of the Dessert Father. Men in the kitchen. But Mr. Stoller told me that the accent was wrong. It's not dessert fathers, it's the desert fathers. And I didn't know anything about them. But I also knew that Mr. Stoller is certainly an expert on accent. He is he's a teacher at St James School and has done a lot in this school for the study of Sanskrit, which sound and accent are key features. I don't know how he knows anything about the Desert Fathers, but I was looking at his beard and the beard.
Is he a descendant?
But don't keep him too long. He's got a lot to say, and there's some real dessert at half past. So, David Stoller.
Thank you.
Well, somebody's giving £5 to their favourite charity if I mention wild turnips. But I'm not going to continue with that subject. I'm going to talk about Queen Victoria. Not many people know that Queen Victoria was visited frequently at the end of her life by an Indian sannyasin, holy man. No doubt he discussed with her her grief over the death of Prince Albert and probably prepared her for her inevitable death. We don't know what they spoke about because her daughter ripped out all the pages of Queen Victoria's diaries that didn't sort with conventional attitudes. And so when she died, this sage was allowed to continue his journey. She didn't let him leave England until she was dead, at which point she could hardly stop him. Now, the gentleman I'm talking about has his picture up on this board. Right, well, I'll describe the picture in a minute for anybody that might buy the tape of this lecture. His name was, at one point, Govindananda Bharati. We don't know what his original name was. That was the name he received when he became a monk at one of the Shankaracharya monasteries. He was later known as the Shivapuri Baba. I'll explain why soon. He was born in 1826. It says that on this blackboard. It also says when he died, and during the next few minutes some of you can do some mathematical calculations. I'll reveal the correct figure later. He was born into a very cultured Brahmana family, and by the age of 12 in fact it was so cultured, this family, that apparently even the servants spoke Sanskrit. At the age of 12 he'd mastered the Vedas, which was the traditional learning for that in that culture, and at the age of 18, I think it was, he went with his uncle, who was a court astrologer, to the forest. In other words, he renounced the householder's life. He didn't marry or have a family, but went straight to the forest. This wasn't surprising to his uncle, because his uncle had realized at the birth of this child, by the smile that he had when he was born, that this boy was going to finish the family line. And in that culture, this meant that he was going to realize God and have no children. This is a concept that we're not too used to in realizing God, but it's quite current in the East. It might catch on here, you never know. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. the tradition was that when you saw your grandchild, you would then quietly slip off to the forest and spend the rest of your life reflecting on the great teachings of the ancient sages. It's a very good system because it's quite likely that the grandmother wouldn't even notice that you'd gone with a new child. So if the grandmother particularly wished to go with him, that was allowed. When they got to the forest, the uncles said, "I've got a great hoard of jewellery here, and I want you to use it. I want you, when you realize God, to make the world pilgrimage." Now, usually the world pilgrimage meant that you'd visit all the holy places of India, and I believe it was considered a method of recharging these pilgrimage sites by wise men being present at them in an endless parade, really. But the uncles said, "I want you to actually literally walk round the world, and these jewels will support you on your way when you need to support yourself." Well, the boy went into the forest, went so far into the forest that at one point he didn't see a human being for 20 years. That wasn't just because he had his eyes closed. But, he was meditating, and eventually, at the age of 50, he realized God, whatever that might mean. He said it came in a flash, and he said at that point all problems were solved. And it was his teaching ever after that to get to that point as soon as you can, and then all your problems will be solved, and start from there. Don't try to sort anything out until then. He, in fact, had a very simple teaching, but, I'm running ahead. He then did go around the world. He visited all the great monarchs, all the great people, many people in the university cities around the world. He's said to have met Einstein, had a brief chat with him about relativity. He met Marconi, had a brief chat with him about wave motion. He met Tolstoy. I don't know who else he met. He may have met Mr. Hines and had a chat about baked beans. I don't know. But not much is known apart from what I've said. Eventually, at about the age of 100, I think he thought he ought to retire or something, and he went back to Nepal and settled at the foot of a mountain called the Shiwapuri, and that's why he was called the Shiwapuri Baba. Baba, I believe, means father. That's the first connection with the title of this lecture, you'll notice. He was visited by the Indian president. I'm not sure whether he was the first president, but the well-known Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. Some of you will have heard of him. He was an immensely erudite man. He'd had a chair at Oxford and also at several other great universities. But he was a humble man, and he made it his business. He was on some sort of diplomatic visit to Nepal, but the first thing he wanted to do was to visit this Shiwapuri Baba. And he approached him and bowed and asked him, I've got it here somewhere, what was his teaching. And the Shiwapuri Baba replied, "I teach 3 disciplines, spiritual, moral, and physical." In the ensuing silence, Radhakrishnan said, "The whole truth in so few words," to which the saint replied, "Yes," which I think is a wonderful conversation, really. Now, apparently at that point, shame and horror passed across Radhakrishnan's face, because he'd realized that in spite of all his erudition, he'd actually more or less wasted the whole of his life. In other words, he understood exactly what the father was saying. But it's possible I may need to spell it out to those of you that haven't had seats at Oxford. In very brief terms, what the saint taught was that there were three disciplines for all human beings. The first is to, as I've got on the board here, do the necessary duties. That means to fulfill all obligations to family, society, and obviously keeping one's own body intact, etc. And that is to be done with no omission, no commission, nothing unnecessary, nothing missed out, and perfectly, with total attention and intelligence. The second duty, which will concern us perhaps more in this lecture, is control the passions of the mind. This is interesting. It's not a very fashionable concept nowadays in this part of the world. What it meant was to keep a pure and still mind in all circumstances. The idea is that this would support the third duty, which I'll come to in a moment. And I'll come back to the method he recommended for the control of the passions of the mind. The third duty was think of God maximum possible. You can hear his English there, can't you? Think of God maximum possible. By God, he didn't have any fixed idea. He said this could be worship, this could be self-inquiry, the question, what am I, was one he recommended. Or this could simply be inquiry into the truth, according to one's particular nature. But the idea is that one should spend the maximum time possible. That was why one should be efficient with one's duties, but not miss any out, because missing duties out gives agitation of mind. The control of the passions of the mind, so that the mind became strong enough to meditate on the divine, was done through the cultivation of the 26 divine virtues, which are spelt out in the 16th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Now that's a big mouthful. There is a famous spiritual classic of India called the Bhagavad Gita, and in its 16th chapter, the first 3 verses spell out 26 divine treasures or virtues. I'll tell you a few of them because these are going to be very relevant to the Desert Fathers that we will get on to, I promise you. The first one is fearlessness. And many other tales of the Desert Fathers facing down lions and things like that. The second is purity of heart, which is possibly the prime desert virtue. The third was ceaseless, uninterrupted pursuit of true knowledge or wisdom. The fourth was generosity. The fifth was control of the senses. The sixth was service of God, fellow human beings, and the lower creatures. The sixth was austerity, a very great speciality of the desert. The seventh was study of the scripture. The eighth, uprightness. That meant straightforwardness, non-crookedness. Now I could go on. There were things like lack of anger, serenity, 26 of these, but I won't go through them all at the moment. And there will be questions at the end if anybody wants me to tell them all. Now he said that this teaching was not his teaching, but God's. Just to go back to his world tour, it was never actually disclosed why he made this world tour. I've got 2 hunches about it. One is that I think he had certain things he needed to say to certain people. 2 is that I think he needed the maximum experience of everything that was going on in the world in order that he could be sure that the teaching he taught was totally relevant to modern conditions. Anyway, he said that these are not my teachings, but God's. They are as old as creation itself. the firstborn man was faced with the problem of maintaining body and solving the riddle of life and creation. So I hope you've got the very simple format of this threefold teaching. I'll just go back to it again in a minute, but I'd like you to look at this picture. For the benefit of those listening to us on tape, it shows a very old man. In fact, it was snapped the day before he died at the age of 137. The face is, of course, quite bony and wrinkled. The hair is quite extraordinary. It's pure white, almost like wires of light surrounding his face. But I think the most extraordinary thing, if you can see it, is the eyes. They're obviously very sunken because of his great, great age, but they're not looking at this world. They're looking at another world, and if you'll excuse my fancy, they seem to be looking right through us, through the superficial levels of our thought and personality, to that which doesn't change. Anyway, that's one of my fancies. It is an extraordinary photograph, and I'm hoping that if the tape ever does get made, this will be on the cover of the tape. Then the people that buy the tape will know what I'm talking about. So that the three teachings, just remember them: do the necessary duties, which at the lowest level, or the simplest level, is merely to upkeep the body. Cultivate the necessary virtues which will still the mind and make it strong enough for the third duty, which is to keep the mind on the divine or on the search for the true meaning of life. Now we turn to the subject of the lecture, and I feel that what I'm going to talk about is a demonstration or example of people, thousands of people, as you'll find out, who were keeping his teaching, although obviously they hadn't heard it from him. Now, what was the social background of this desert movement that I'm going to talk about? We have a chart up on the board here. But before we go through it, actually, I'm going to read something about what was happening. This was at the end of the Roman Empire. And I'm going to read some excerpts from this book. I doubt if many of you have read it. It only came out about 6 weeks ago. It tells the story of how 4 major civilizations arose and eventually declined. By the way, the 4th of these civilizations is our own. Rather pessimistic, but she backs it up in this book. And describing the end of the Roman Empire, these are some of the things she says. Now, under the Emperor Severus in the year 193 AD, robbers were rampant on land and sea. Travel ceased to be safe, and piracy made commerce practically impossible. In the 73 years from the death of Severus to the accession of Diocletian, there were 24 more or less legitimate emperors and many more usurpers. In Italy, centre of the Roman Empire, barbarian invaders intent on loot, sometimes enthusiastically abetted by local soldiers and peasantry, sacked peripheral towns and even penetrated itself where defensive walls had to be built. To the north, the multiplicity of Germanic tribes were federating into threatening agglomerations. The throne now commanded fear, but not respect. And in these circumstances, the great system of voluntary service that had upheld the society at that time broke down. Furthermore, the propertied classes were overwhelmed by the huge taxes being exacted to pay for defense expenditure. By now, local governors were being made responsible not merely for the collection of taxes, but for making good any tax deficit out of their own pockets. The well-to-do began to flee the municipalities rather than be eligible for duty, not surprising. Anyone with a country estate retired to it, fortifying it against the depredations not only of bandits, but of imperial tax demands. In the disruption of the times, productivity was falling, land was abandoned, it was uneconomic to continue to retain it in use. Private enterprise virtually ceased. In the absence of business activity, interest rates fell. Commerce was disrupted not only by the lawlessness of the trade routes and the decay of the ill-maintained highways, but also by instability in the financial markets. Inflation began to menace the whole economy. Worthless money was issued, which was widely distrusted. In AD 301, Diocletian promulgated a prices and incomes policy, blaming the economic troubles on speculators. Bit familiar, isn't it? 26 years before this edict, in the year 275, there had gone out into the Egyptian desert a solitary Christian named Antony, the first of the anchorites. 24 years after the edict, in 325, Pachomius, concerned that solitude might be a form of selfishness, founded a monastery at Tabenne in Egypt and gathered the desert hermits into a community of monks. The complexities of the empire and its assailants held no interest for them. They were seeking for a kingdom that was not of this world. It was their ideals that were to shape the next millennium in Europe. A new culture was about to be born. And to underline that time scale, we have a chart up here. I'm going to read it through with a few additions that aren't on the blackboard. In the years 249 to 51, there was persecution of Christians by the Emperor Decius, and there were many martyrdoms. Just a word about martyrdoms. Once the martyrdoms started to ease off and the Christian empire, such as it was, became Christian, the people that went to the desert used to consider that they were undergoing a different sort of martyrdom. It was a sort of, there was the red martyrdom, the bloody martyrdom, and then the desert withdrawal was called the white martyrdom. Now, in the year 251, Antony was born. This is St Antony the Great. In the year 254, Origen died. Origen was perhaps the greatest of the early Christian fathers. He was later... what do they do to people that say that things the church doesn't agree with? It's not excommunication, it's apothec something. Anyway, he was something like that, right. He wasn't thought very highly of a few hundred years after anyway, because he taught things like reincarnation and I believe vegetarianism. I'm not sure of that one. Anyway, he is an important figure for our story. He died in 254, and Antony was very much a follower of Origen, as we'll find out. In 255, there was plague in Egypt, but at the same time, Christianity was being adopted by thousands. In the year 260, the plague spread right across the Roman Empire, which was also under attack by then from barbarians. In the year 271, Antony sold all and began to live outside his village in a little hut. In the year 286, he fled into the inner desert. In the year 303, there were further persecutions of Christians. I think that was the last great persecution. In the year 320, Pachomius founded the first desert monastery. In the year 333, the Romans began withdrawing troops from Britain. That, I think, is the last mention of Britain. In the year 357, the Life of Antony was published by Athanasius, and this book became very influential. We'll hear some extracts from it. In the year 383, somebody called Evagrius came to the desert. We'll hear more about him. In the year 393, Augustine wrote his famous Confessions, and somebody called John Cassian came to Egypt, to the desert, and we'll be hearing more about him. He was a great influence on St. Benedict. In the year 408, Rome was besieged. 410, Rome was sacked and Italy ravaged. 472, Rome was sacked again. It was sacked many times, actually, and finally gave up. So that in 476, the Western Empire finally was extinguished. The Eastern Christian Empire carried on, as you probably know. And this was the beginning of what we call the Dark Ages. In the year 515, St. Benedict wrote his famous rule, which was followed by most monasteries thereafter, and there are still many Benedictine monasteries going. In the year 549, comets, earthquakes, plague. In the year 629, the Quran was revealed to Muhammad. In the year 642, Alexandria, the greatest city of Egypt, fell to the Arabs. And that was a different story again, which obviously we won't follow, but it really marked the end of the great period of the Desert Fathers. So now we move on to St. Antony. And this is how Athanasius tells the story of his great conversion. He was left alone after his parents' death with one quite young sister. He was about 18 or even 20 years old, and he was responsible both for the home and his sister. 6 months had not passed since the death of his parents when, going to the Lord's house, the church, as usual, and gathering his thoughts, he considered while he walked how the apostles, forsaking everything, had followed the Saviour, and how the Acts of the Apostles tell that some sold what they possessed and took the proceeds and placed them at the feet of the apostles for distribution among those in need, and what great hope is stored up for such people in heaven. He went into the church pondering these things, and just then it happened that the gospel was being read, and he heard the words of the Lord to the rich man, "If thou wilt be perfect, go, sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me." It was as if the passage were read on his account. And he duly sold up, leaving provision for his sister, and withdrew to the aforementioned hut outside his village. 15 years later, he went further out, right into the desert, the first of the Desert Fathers. At least the first. He did meet another father out there called Paul, and that's another story again. But he is the person that founded the great movement. In fact, he must have been an extraordinary man. It's very hard to make him out. Only 6 letters that are definitely his still survive. There are many stories of him, and he obviously had many, many disciples. And by the end of his life, there were more people in the desert than there were in the surrounding cities. And that is true. Now, we'll listen to some extracts from his letters and get some idea of his teaching. He was a follower of Origen, it seems, and Origen was a Platonist, among other things, and we're going to hear some of what Plato said shortly. This is what, for instance, this is how Antony started one of his letters. "Truly, my beloved," and he's talking to congregations of monks in the desert that he had responsibility for. "Truly, my beloved, I write to you as to wise men who are able to know yourselves. For he who knows himself knows God. Now, this is the Platonic teaching, the teaching of self-knowledge. It's not. It's an unusual thing for a Christian to be talking about, but it is a Platonic teaching. I'd like to point that out. In another letter, he says, again greeting them, "All of you who have prepared yourselves to come to God, I greet you in the Lord, my beloved, the young and the old, men and women, saints in your spiritual essence." Now, what he's referring to there is the Platonic teaching that the essence of man is divine. And it's not particularly a Christian teaching, who taught that the essence of man is fallen, in fact. So that's an interesting side to Antony's teaching. He goes on to say, "We are all created from one invisible essence, that we may love one another with a single love. For all they who know themselves know they are of one immortal substance. We are members of one another. But if a member is estranged from the body, having no contact with the head, but delighting in the passions of the flesh, it has contracted an incurable wound and has forgotten its beginning and its end." So he's saying that due to men becoming separate, they have contracted a wound. "For this reason," he went on, "the Father of creation, moved with compassion towards this our wound, which none of the creatures could heal, but only the goodness of the Father, sent us his only begotten Son, and taught us that we are all of one essence, and members one of another. Therefore we ought greatly to love one another, for he who loves his neighbour loves God, and he who loves God loves his own soul. Whoever sins against his neighbour sins against him, and whoever does evil to his neighbour does evil to himself. Likewise, whoever does good to his neighbour does good to himself." So this is an extraordinary thing. Here is someone that separated himself by hundreds of miles from the whole of humanity and lives a totally secluded life, and his main teaching is that we should love one another and not be separated. And this is a paradox which we'll see recurring right the way through this story. Now, when his life, as I said, was written by Athanasius, who was held him in high regard, people began to come from far and wide to the desert, and this work, the Life of St Antony, was very influential. St Augustine's conversion was partly due to reading this book. Now, in Athanasius' Life of Antony, he describes how the desert became after a few years. He said, "The monks' cells in the hills were like tents filled with divine choirs, people chanting, studying, fasting, praying, rejoicing in the hope of future boons, working for the distribution of alms, and maintaining both love and harmony among themselves. It was as if one truly looked on a land all its own, a land of devotion and righteousness. For neither perpetrator nor victim of injustice was there, nor complaint of a tax collector. And there was a multitude of ascetics, but among them all there was one mind, and it was set on so that when one saw the cells again and such orderliness among the monks, he was moved to exclaim and say, 'How lovely are your dwellings, Jacob, and your tents, Israel, like shady groves and like a garden by a river, and like tents which the Lord pitched, and like cedars beside the waters.'" So that's some sort of background. What were these monks like? Well, the story which has lived with me from my late teens, when I first heard about the Desert Fathers, is the following, which gives some idea of the character of these men. It's in the rather beautiful translation of Helen Waddell. I'll show you some books that are available later. "There were two old men living together in one cell, and never had there risen even the paltriest contention between them. So the one said to the other, let us have one quarrel the way other men do. But the other said, I do not know how one makes a quarrel. The first said, look, I set a tile between us and say, that is mine, and do thou say, it is not thine, it is mine. And thence arises contention and squabble. So they set the tile between them, and the first one said, that is mine. And the second made reply, I hope that it is mine. And the first said, it is not thine, it is mine. To which the second made answer, if it is thine, take it. After which they could find no way of quarrelling. Now perhaps we'll look at the first discipline of the Shivapuri Baba, to do the necessary duties. Now what sort of basic physical life did these monks live? Well, the first thing they did was to build a cell. In fact, it wasn't like that. They'd turn up in the desert and the other monks would... Can you hear all right? The other monks would build them a cell. This was part of the love thy neighbour as thyself teaching that they were following. Having had a cell built for them, and it would never be within hearing range or even sight of any other cell, they would spend most of the day and all of the night, except for a brief hour or so of sleep, praying. I'll go into what praying meant for them later. But there was a difficulty, and this was solved by St Antony when he had a vision, and the story goes like this. When the holy abbot, abbot meaning father, not necessarily the head of a monastery, so desert fathers are the desert abbas, the desert abbots. When the holy abbot Antony was living in the desert, his soul fell into a weariness and confusion of thought, and he began saying to God, Lord, I would be made whole, and my thoughts will not suffer me. What shall I do in this tribulation? How shall I be whole? And in a little while, rising up, he began to walk in the open, and he saw someone, as it might be himself, sitting and working, and then rising from his work and praying, and again sitting down and making a plate of palm leaves, Plait, and then rising once again to prayer. Now it was an angel of the Lord sent to the reproof and warning of Antony, and he heard the voice of the angel saying, This do, and thou shalt be whole. And hearing it, he took great joy of it and courage, and in so doing he found the deliverance that he sought. And after this he alternated, and so did all the monks, prayer and some form of physical work. In fact, mainly they wove baskets, which they wove from the reeds of the nearby salt marshes that were there, and they sold them every so often. They went into the city and sold their baskets, and this enabled them to buy their daily ration of 2 little rolls. So that was their economic subsistence system. There's a delightful story about this, which I shall read. Remember, for instance, in St. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, if any would not work, neither shall he eat. Famous teaching. Now, a stranger monk came to the abbot Silvanus in Mount Sinai. There were many monks in cells in the Palestinian desert as well as the Egyptian desert. And he saw the brethren, this should say working, saw the brethren busy in the fields, and said to them, Wherefore do ye labour for the meat that perisheth? For Mary chose that good part. And no doubt some of you will recognize the story in the Gospels about Martha and Mary. So that's what he said. For Mary chose that good part, which of course was contemplation rather than service. Then said the old man to Zachary his disciple, give him a codex to read, that's a sort of a scroll, and put him in a cell that has nothing in it. By the 9th hour, however, the brother was gazing up and down the road to see if perchance the old man would call him to a meal. And when the hour had gone by, he came to the old man and said, "Are the brethren not eating today, father?" Then said the abbot Silvanus, "Thou art a spiritual man, and thou dost not hold food to be necessary, but we, being carnal, have need to eat, and to that end we work. But thou hast chosen that good part. For thou readest all day, and hast no wish for carnal food." And on hearing this, he began to be ashamed, and said, "Forgive me, father." And the abbot Silvanus answered him, "So Martha is necessary to Mary, for because of Martha is Mary praised." So there was a tradition of work, and as you know, this went down into the Benedictine rule, the tradition of work and prayer being equally important. Now, as you may have gathered, one major characteristic of the life of these men was their asceticism. There's the famous words from the letter to the Colossians, "Mortify therefore your members which are on earth." When I quote the Bible, these are usually quotations that the monks held especially sacred and often quoted. Now, they fasted. As I said, they had 2 rolls a day. Sometimes they had some oil with those rolls. Sometimes they grew vegetables, and they had brackish water which they carried from the salt marshes or the springs which weren't nearby. They purposely put themselves a long way away from the water supply so that they had to walk for it, a further burden. Here's another story. Father Joseph asked Father Poemen, the shepherd, you'll hear a lot about him, "How should one fast?" And Father Poemen said to him, "For my part, I think it better that one should eat every day, but only a little, so as not to be satisfied." And Father Joseph said to him, "When you were younger, did you not fast 2 days at a time, Father?" And the old man said, "Yes, even for 3 days, and 4, and the whole week." The fathers tried all this out as they were able, and they found it preferable to eat every day, but just a small amount. They have left us this royal way, which is light. Then there was sleep, or in fact the lack of it. The famous quotation from the Psalms, "I will not give sleep to mine eyes or slumber to mine eyelids until I find out a place for the Lord." And some of these fathers used to remain without sleep for a week at a time, sometimes a month at a time, and they used to occasionally, they used to support themselves and sometimes lean against a wall and sleep for a few moments and then go back to their prayer. They used to pray standing up with their arms up, further delight. Some of you may have seen the pictures in the catacombs of the prayer, like this. Now, it was said, you may say, well, why weren't they sleeping? Well, the idea was, and you can try it if you like, that sleep thickens thought, as one master said, but good vigil hones it fine. And another master said, long sleep, that's probably more than 2.5 hours, produces forgetfulness, but keeping vigil purifies the memory. So try that out and see. Now, another discipline they followed was the restraint of the senses. The idea you follow was that they had their mind on God for maximum time possible. And therefore, they didn't want to be distracted by any outside beauty or object of interest. There's the story here that I'll tell. One day, a priest of the desert went to the blessed Theophilus, Archbishop of Alexandria, and when he returned to the desert, the brothers asked him, "What is the city like?" And he said to them, "Indeed, brothers, I did not see anyone there except the archbishop." On learning this, they were greatly troubled and said, "Has everyone been destroyed then, Father?" He said to them, "No, but the temptation to look at anyone did not overcome me." On hearing this, they were full of admiration, and from this saying they drew strength to guard their eyes from wandering. Some people think this is why they wore those cowls, rather like horses with blinkers. Another discipline was silence, that is, silence of speech. One father said to his disciple, "Be careful never to let an irrelevant word come into this cell." But the silence they observed was part of a much greater silence, the silence of the desert. And there's a story about this. It was said that there were 3 friends who were not afraid of hard work. The first chose to reconcile those who were fighting each other. As it is said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." The second chose to visit the sick. The third went to live in prayer and stillness in the desert. Now, in spite of all his labors, the first could not make peace in all men's quarrels. And in his sorrow he went to him who was serving the sick. And he found him also disheartened, for he could not fulfill that commandment either. So they went together to see him who was living in the stillness of prayer. They told him their difficulties and begged him to tell them what to do. After a short silence, he poured some water into a bowl and said to them, "Look at this water." And it was disturbed. After a little while he said to them again, "Look how still the water is now." And as they looked into the water, they saw their own faces reflected in it as in a mirror. Then he said to them, "It is the same for those who live among men. Disturbances prevent them from seeing their faults. But when a man is still, especially in the desert, then he sees his failings. And seeing your failings is the first step to overcoming them." Now, behind all this asceticism and silence, etc., was the main idea, which was the destruction of self-will, or the death of the ego. Poemen the shepherd said, "The will of man is a brass wall between him and God, and a stone of stumbling." One monk was living close to a monastery, and he led a very austere life, they say. And it happened that some visitors came to the monastery and constrained him to eat outside the proper time. Afterwards the brothers said to him, "Father, were you not grieved by that?" And he said to them, "I am grieved only when I do my own will." Now, part of this attack on the ego, practice of obedience, because these fathers had disciples, and no monk was supposed to be acting under his own authority. One of the mothers of the desert, Amma, that means mother, Syncretica, said, "Obedience is preferable to asceticism. The one teaches pride, the other humility." And the Institutes of John Cassian, do you remember that name? It's on the board there. He wrote the rules of the monasteries of the desert, and these were taken up by St Benedict. He tells how those who wish to join a monastery